Welcome back to the Chinese Food Fight Club podcast. I'm Danica, and I'm here with my co-host Andy Wang.
Hi. We're getting used to this time zone difference, I think, right? Where it's just early for me and a little later in your day. I mean, it works.
I think we have mastered it. I think morning your time is great, right? And then afternoon my time, I still have some light. So we'll see how it gets like later on in the winter when in England the sun starts to set at 3 o'clock and then, I'll have to buy a light or something. But right now, I think we're doing okay. How are you doing? How has your week been? We've been so busy.
I know we've been nuts, just like scheduling things, planning some things that we're about to launch. It's been good. School's back. That's made things a little bit easier, with two children gone for a little bit during the day. But yeah, I feel like LA is in the middle of like, it feels like people are just like ready to sort of like go outside and at least see things and do things a little bit, which feels good.
I totally agree. I've actually been going to London way more than I had planned to go to London when I first moved back to England. I live in Oxford, so I'm about an hour and a half, sometimes 2 hours, 2.5 hours on a really bad traffic day away from London. But I've been going in to see some friends and I've been spending way more time in London's Chinatown, which I want to talk a little bit about because I've noticed it's like gotten so different than when I last spent a lot of time there, maybe 15, 20 years ago. But I don't know about you, Andy. I feel like since we've started recording this podcast, I mean, not that I like wasn't Chinese American to start with, but I started to notice how Asian food and Chinese food and Asian food pop culture is just everywhere I look now, everywhere from obviously Marvel movies now to television to all my streaming services to every book I pick up in the bookstore. It just feels pervasive. And I don't know if you feel the same way.
I mean, I was just like in on the East Coast driving around like through New England, just like stopping at shopping malls where there were stores that I hadn't seen in years, like Spencer Gifts. Multiple stores like Spencer's that essentially are like cater to teenagers or people who are even younger in some cases, or whatever, adults who want sex toys and like weird gag gifts. But what I noticed is there are like, anime themed and actual anime collections in like all of these places. There are now curated Asian snack boxes in most of these places. So yeah, it's a thing where it's really just showing up like where you don't expect it. Because growing up, it's like I grew up in Texas. I remember going to the mall. Like you could not go buy shrimp chips at the Spencer's Gift when I was 8 years old. That would have been cool. No, we'd have to drive to the Chinese grocery store to do that now. So yeah, I like that it's just shifting, and I also just like that you know, Asians and Asian Americans are just like such a big part of pop culture now too. I mean, it's like Lisa from Blackpink just knocked Drake off the charts. She's got the number one rap song in America right now. And she's not Chinese, but the fact is it's like it's just this whole idea of what you can be as an Asian person now, meaning that like she's in the biggest South Korean music group. I mean, honestly, in history, she's actually Thai, and now she has a hip hop song, and it's like charting number one in America.
I mean,
So
I've watched so many Blackpink documentaries and YouTube videos, and I totally get why they are so famous. They're sort of like they're so multicultural and they're from Asia, which I think is an idea that kind of boggles a lot of minds in the West. Obviously, I mean, Orientalism going way back and thinking about all that post-colonialist stuff, but there's always been this idea that Asia is this one monolithic thing. And how Asia has done diplomacy in this soft diplomacy way, and I don't mean just shipping pandas all over the world, I mean through pop culture, through food, it has been a slow process. I totally agree. We're about the same age. Growing up, I grew up in New York City and I grew up in a very diverse and multicultural neighborhood, but still I had to explain shrimp chips to people, right? And I had to explain Pocky and things like that when I was a little kid. But now it feels like all these things are so much more mainstreamed. I feel like a lot of it is due to social media, but also the exporting of so many different kinds of regional foods, cuisines, and obviously music and movies.
yeah, I mean, it just there are all these things that are happening at the same time, and some of them are very, very obvious. Obviously, something like Crazy Rich Asians, and some of them are like you have to dig a little bit. You don't even have to dig a little bit. You just sort of have to pay. You sort of have to pay attention, right? Like my daughter's been watching this show on Disney Plus called Bizarre from a few years ago, and it's this ridiculous show because it's Olivia Rodrigo's on it and Jake Paul is on it, and the other lead is this Asian girl who's now this Asian young woman, Madison Hugh. And it was just like this big thing, not a big deal. Obviously, we all know what's happened to Paul and what's happened to Rodrigo. But also, it's one of those things where you're watching this, just like there are two female leads, and they are both Asian American because Olivia Rodrigo is half Filipina from California. And so there are these weird things that, as a man in my 40s, maybe I shouldn't be taking pride in. But it's like, you know what? I'm taking pride in this because these, in a way, like these are my daughter's actual role models. It's a show about essentially like making a YouTube show. And the other day she had a play date and she and her friend just like filmed themselves making like these YouTube videos. And she's just been like watching them. And, when you're 7 years old, that's creativity, not narcissism. I mean, maybe it's a little narcissism, but it's just the cutest thing. And it's just interesting to me too, because it's, to use the term that people use in LA, both my daughter and also her friend are mixed race. You could call them Hapa, and they're just like they're watching the show that seems very, very American without even quite realizing that, oh, this is American, but this is also Asian American. And that coincides with this really cool thing where at my daughter's school they're decorating something for this program called This Is Us, and you're all supposed to draw something about your heritage. And look, like a lot of Asian American kids, my kids are proud of their heritage, but they don't think that much about it. But when they realized, oh, wait, we have chopsticks and rice and pandas and things that are red and firecrackers and red envelopes, I mean, they got super excited and wanted to draw this. So I think that like it's just, I mean, look, California is a super progressive place, but I just like that I see this happening like in every facet of my life now.
It's so interesting when little kids, I don't have kids, but I have a niece and she is about 6 years old. And my brother took his family down to Florida last year when there was like lockdown, there was no school, they were doing remote school. He's like, we cannot keep these kids in an apartment in New York City for the entire winter. So they went down to Florida. And once in a while, they would go eat Chinese food in Chinese restaurants. And my niece, the first time they went to a really good Chinese restaurant in Florida, she was like, oh my goodness, this place is full of Chinese people. There are Chinese people in Florida. And I love that little kids, that moment where they realize they're like, that something is part of their identity and they can relate it to people around them. And obviously like New York is, like California, very diverse, and she's exposed to lots of different types or kids from all different backgrounds going to school. But it's just so, I love experiencing that realization through their eyes again. I think it's so powerful, and it's a totally different world now, for better or for worse, in the 21st century than it was in the 1980s when you and I were growing up. But it is, this heritage thing it's something that obviously we carry around with us everywhere we go. And what we've talked about wanting to do on this podcast is actually talking about things openly, where we think about it all the time, but we don't necessarily get to talk about it with our friends. I have a lot of friends, if I started to talk about like Chinese immigration patterns, they'd be like, shut up, let's just go for a cocktail.
Right. But then you tell them, but this explains why Szechuan food happened the way that it did. And then they're like, oh, that's a little more interesting,
Yeah.
So, yeah, I mean, I guess like the point that we're making is like, today's podcast and a lot of other podcasts, it's just going to be us talking about different things that are, part of the Chinese American world that we care about. And it's going to mostly tie back to food, and sometimes it won't, and it's fine. But really, like almost everything ties back to food in an easy way. So, I mean, I guess the one thing that we're sort of getting to is just how all of these things are just Asian culture, Asian food culture. It's becoming more and more ubiquitous. So it's something that I've been seeing in LA. There's this restaurateur, Bill Chait, super prominent. He brought tartine to LA. He opened up things like Bestie and Republique. I mean, I don't want to go through his whole resume, but if you just think about how important those restaurants that I just mentioned are, you understand that he does things that are of a very significant magnitude. He's doing something at the Academy Museum where he's opening a restaurant. and Wolfgang Puck Catering is also at the museum. So it's that level of seriousness, right? He's done things like attached to huge arenas. He's just opened a Szechuan restaurant. It is called Mian. It is an offshoot of the Chengdu Taste Mian empire started by the chef in the San Gabriel Valley, Szechuan chef in the San Gabriel Valley, Tony Xu, who has restaurants in LA and in Vegas now. The new Mian is not in a Chinese neighborhood. It is in West Adams, this neighborhood that some might associate, as being part of South LA, or a neighborhood that other people might think is like, oh, it's this up and coming restaurant neighborhood because Daniel Patterson has a restaurant Alta there. Tartine is about to open there. There's a great Middle Eastern restaurant, Ms. Lala, that just opened there. There's a lot of things happening there. It's one of those things where, for better or worse, as we've talked about in the past, like gentrifying neighborhoods, and it doesn't matter what you read into the word gentrifying, whether you think it's positive or negative, they tend not to ungentrify, right? Meaning that like if something goes, it just keeps going. So the fact that Chinese food from a really prominent restaurateur is part of this neighborhood makeover, like I feel is really significant because Belche doesn't just open one restaurant, he opens a bunch of restaurants. He takes ideas and he figures out like, okay, what can I do with these things? He traveled to Chengdu to research this restaurant. So we know that he was serious about this. But it just makes me think of something we've been talking about for a while. Like we love Szechuan food so much. When is Szechuan food actually going to have its moment where it just goes mainstream? Is it too law to be mainstream? Is the mala too much for people to handle? Or some of the ingredients, like a little too aggressive? Do the pictures with all the chilies end up being more of a turn off than a turn on? I mean, I don't know. I mean, what I do know is that I'm a Flyby Jing, this prominent California-based Szechuan chili crisp company, recently raised a lot of private equity funding, and it's going to be in stores like Target and Whole Foods in the near future. And they just released a hot pot line, which I am about to try. The one that I have is actually vegan hot pot, so I think they're already sort of thinking about the Whole Foods crowd and all that. So I hope Szechuan food gets more and more mainstream, but like I'm glad that like a lot of this stuff is starting in California and I just get to experience it first.
I think there's a lot of education that needs to happen because obviously things like gongbao ji, like kung pao chicken, has been mainstreamized because you can buy it at like your mall Chinese takeout restaurant, but no one's categorized that in the American psyche as Sichuanese food. And I think the American psyche will have a shift over the next 10, 20 years to understand that Chinese food, I mean, I had this problem working at major food brands, like major food media brands, where I would have to explain to senior leadership that Chinese food is not just one thing, right? So the same way, and I would have to explain it in terms of metaphors, like we were doing packages about Chinese food or Asian food or food from different Asian countries. And they'd be like, well, we can just write about the food from, Sichuan and just call it all the same thing as like Chinese food. I'm like, no, that would be like saying that Southern food and food in Portland, Maine is the same thing, right? I think that explaining things to the American mainstream in terms of America and understanding geography and the breadth and the magnitude of Chinese culinary history and culture, it has to be, there's a whole education process that has to happen. Right now, it's just like a mishmash. And not only is there just pan-Chinese, but there's also pan-Asian. Those restaurants, just it's like Japanese, Chinese, it's all mixed together. So I think there's about a decade out. We're about a decade out from people understanding the differences between regional Chinese food. And a lot of this, I'm always banging on about immigration patterns. And this is something that I've been obsessed with, forever. But recently, because I've been going into London so much and spending quite a lot of time in Chinatown, not like, the Chinese food offerings in Oxford are fantastic, but it's limited. This is a town of 100,000 people. But I've been going into London just to, get that flavor, just like taste the food that I want to taste. And I've noticed that the last time I spent time in Chinatown was 15, 20 years ago as a student. I went to a school that was very, very close to Chinatown. And for reference, and in case anyone hasn't been to Chinatown in London, it's sandwiched in between Soho, Covent Garden, and the theater district. So it's extremely central. And back in the 90s, the first time that I think like you and I probably like went there, we didn't know each other at the time, but I think our
Yeah.
families traveled there. Chinatown was maybe 2 blocks and very stereotypical. I think it was all owned by one developer. They had the Chinese lanterns. And now when you go there, it is massive. It is solidly at least between 6 and 8 square blocks. And the Chinese restaurants are now picking up real estate all around Piccadilly Circus, which is right next to it, right next door. So the spread and the sprawl is incredible. And a lot of this is down. I looked up a lot of these statistics. I thought there had been a huge reinvestment project in Chinatown by the London government or something, but it is all private developers who are like spilling hundreds of billions of dollars into London. And part of it is because the last American administration limited visas and investment from China so much. So, for example, all of the students that were scheduled to may have applied to Harvard or Stanford or gone to school in the United States. Instead, they've all decided to come to London. And I think this year, the number of Chinese overseas students studying in London is 219,000 or 216,000, just over 200,000. And those students in 1 year will account for 470 million pounds of spending and 300 million pounds of tuition fees, all fed into the British economy. And what we know from the States is that wherever the students go, the good food follows. Right?
Yeah, we're obsessed with this because it's, as you and I have talked about this so many times. There are obviously all of these Chinese restaurants, Szechuan, Hunan, Hot Pot, etc., that since we've left New York, I mean, sadly for us, they have opened up, in the East Village and around there because of proximity to NYU. In LA, there's the other most prominent Szechuan restaurant, this group called Szechuan Impression from the San Gabriel Valley, opened in Westwood. You know where Westwood is? Westwood is where UCLA is. I was driving around Long Island this summer and found a restaurant called Szechuan Grandma, very legit Szechuan food, just on the North Shore of Long Island. And I was driving around there and I'm like, okay, there's an Italian deli here, but there's 2 legitimate looking dumpling places and another Szechuan restaurant all within 2 miles. And I'm like, what the hell is going on? And of course, the Stony Brook University was within a few miles of where I was. And I'm like, yes, of course.
It has been my dream it's always been my dream to map those university towns and all the best Chinese restaurants. I think in what you're talking about in the East Village on 7th between 3rd and Avenue B, it's 2 or 3 blocks. It's called Little Taiwan now because it's next to Cooper Union and it's close. There's so much student housing there. It's just incredible that all these mini Chinatowns are springing up all over the world. And what I love about mini Chinatowns, and you guys have this more than anywhere else in California, is that Chinatown, even though it's called Chinatown, it becomes a catch-all safe space / community for so many immigrants from Asia. And I love that. And that is also where you see new businesses from all over Asia, from first-generation immigrants, start springing up. And that idea of community is so powerful when you think about history.
So here's a free idea for our private equity and our quick service food friends. Based on what we're saying, I really do believe that there's a market where you could do a test run of a better Chinese American fast casual restaurant. It could be Sichuan, it could be Hunan, it could be all of those, and just drop them at, whatever, the top 20 college campuses, with Chinese student populations across America.
So this sort of exists. In New York, it's Junzi Kitchen. They did it. It's a bunch of Yale grads who all got together in their senior year. I don't know how they decided to do this in their senior year. They're all from Hong Kong or Northern China. I think one of the partners is from Beijing, and they're young. And they all moved to New York and they started Junzi Kitchen, and they only open near college campuses. So there's one down by NYU, near Cooper Union. There's 1 or 2 up by Columbia. There's one in New Haven by Yale. and they've done so well. It's mostly northern Chinese cuisine,
Right.
but it's fast casual, and it's like Chipotle. You get in the line, you're like, I want this wrap, I want this filling, I want that sauce. It all comes together, and it is so good. And it tastes nothing like stereotypical Chinese fast food or fast casual food.
Yeah, and I mean and you see some of these things happening in Brooklyn too, because there's a lot of colleges in Brooklyn, some around downtown Brooklyn. I've definitely noticed in the time I've left that not besides Shang Famous there are just other noodle and dumpling places that have just opened because they're really seeing this opportunity too. But I do feel like whether it's Junzi Kitchen or somebody else, like somebody could potentially roll out 20 or 30 of these just like all over the country because it's a no-brainer thing, right? You think about the things that are trending right now, hot chicken, smash burgers, whatever. I mean, the Asian versions of that are more delicious, in my opinion, obviously, but also like in a way more built for Instagram because you want a hot chicken. Here's a hot chicken with 8,000 chilies on it.
That will numb your mouth.
Yeah, exactly. We can make you a mouth numbing lamb burger, right? It's like, so there are all these things that really could happen, but it's just something that we want to say, to steal the term that a lot of people use, but like it'd be good for the culture.
I also think that there's a very strong track record of Asian chain restaurants succeeding, right? So obviously the big ones are like PF Chang's, and then in the UK I'm sure we can find some, but I'm so curious to see what the next big Asian chain restaurant will be. Obviously we know about Panda, but I think I'm really curious. I think it's high time. I totally agree. It'll work. Someone put their money up and let's do it.
Yeah, and I mean there are people who are like attached to this that could do this because one of our guests that we've had on is Shirley Chung. She's the number one seller in Los Angeles on Goldbelly, which means there's a huge demand for dumplings and tea smoked duck to be shipped nationwide. Obviously the Chung family at Panda Express, like they've got long arms and then they can do lots of things. But the other crazy thing is that whether you think this is a good company or an evil company or a complicated company or something in between, DoorDash is started by Tony Xu. Yeah, same name as the Chengdu chef in LA. It's kind of crazy. Who is obviously the Chinese American MBA tech entrepreneur who, at the very least, has like publicly, raised concerns about API issues. Like, look, they may end up never really they've got virtual restaurants, so maybe a real restaurant would be just going backwards for them, but they're the ones that like more than anybody else might figure out robot delivery or something. So like we've got some Chinese Americans that are on the case.
I think Xi'an Famous Foods does really well on Goldbelly too. At least I know all of my friends have ordered it.
It's so delicious. It's a lot of work. It's like so Chinese, right? They send you a whole head of cabbage and you're supposed to slice it and you're supposed to hand pull the noodles yourself. And it literally says, this thing will take you one serving will take you 15 to 30 minutes to make. And I'm like, if you're just a normal home chef and you're not good at mise en place, it's going to take you that long just to chop and pull all the shit. Forget cooking it.
They send you a head of lettuce, a head of cabbage. That's crazy. That's
head of cabbage. I was like, the first time I got it, I was like Instagramming it, and John Yao was asking me if it was good. I'm like, John, John, who's the chef at Cato, he's earned a Michelin star, but really cares about Taiwanese food and Chinese food in general. He's asking me about it. And I was just texting him back, John, they sent me a whole head of cabbage. This is how Chinese this is.
That's
but
like
I love that.
Story. I love that so much. I wish that you had done it as a video. Maybe we should how about for an episode, we'll do like a cook along on a video and we'll like order, like one of us will do it from scratch. Like I can, because I live in England, I'll just go to the supermarket and I'll buy the stuff and you can order the stuff and we'll just prepare it together. Maybe we get the Xi'an Famous Food people to do it with us on camera and we can like talk through it with people. That's also been a dream of mine. When I was working at Food and Wine and Epicurious, I was like, this is what we should do. We should do subscription boxes where we send out the stuff and then everyone tunes in for a live cook along because nobody wants to shop for stuff, especially in the pandemic.
Yeah, no, I mean, I know that's an idea that different people are playing with, but I would love to do that for Chinese food, But yeah, I just like, yeah, it would be great to get Jason Wang and Xiang Famous on because, he's still like, I think in his 30s now because he was in like Forbes 30 under 30 and all that. but he's been at this for a while. He's had to do all these different pivots. He's probably gotten approached with countless financing, but his family recipes, his secret recipes have just stayed the same, even as like scaled all over New York. And it is one of the things that I will eat every single time I go to New York. I ate it twice within 2 days in New York, and I went out of my way both ways to do it, like both in Manhattan and in Brooklyn. And then 2 weeks later, when I was back in LA, I craved it and I ordered it on Goldbelly. It's really that good. I mean, you should go order it on Goldbelly. You should go buy Jason's cookbook because, again, we were talking about how Chinese food isn't just one thing. His food, if you have not had it, the hand pulled noodles, with the lamb and the beef and the pork belly and the secret spices and the really, and the really aggressive chili sauce. It's not like most of the Chinese food that you've eaten if you've never eaten this type of food.
So I went to, well, I mean, I think this is such an interesting story because I think if we go back to where we all first heard of Xi'an famous food, it was because of Anthony Bourdain and a show on CNN where he went to that basement mall in Flushing. And
Mhm.
at the time, Xi'an famous foods was just a counter. They didn't even have a sink. They were doing everything on a counter and everything was disposable. They would give you the food, you would eat it, you would sit down, and then you would get up and you would throw away everything. And then you would hope someone would have a wet wipe. So that is where that now massive business started from. And I can't even imagine what has remained undiscovered that is just under our noses in places like Flushing, Queens, where I grew up, where no one is filming TV shows in basements there anymore. Like maybe there's some
Yeah.
intrepid YouTubers doing it. But also, so because of Xi'an famous foods, when I had the opportunity a couple of years ago to go to the Xi'an province in China, I went there and it was, I mean, I can't even begin to describe how amazing the food culture there is overall. So Xi'an they have a very historical Muslim food culture there. So the spices are all very different. The meat is completely different. They obviously don't eat certain things. There's very little pork. And that changes the landscape of food culture because if you know Chinese food, by and large, there is a lot of pork in Chinese food in most
Right.
areas. So it's a completely different food culture, drink culture, flavor profile. It is incredible. And if you ever have a chance to go, once everything calms down and opens up again, like by all means, get on a plane and go there.
And that point that you're making about how they didn't even have a sink. I mean, the thing that a lot of people don't realize is like that in a way is sort of like the most Asian thing, right? Like David Chang was talking about how he wanted Spoon by H to be a different kind of restaurant because they didn't never intended to, be this prominent Korean restaurant. The chef just happened to be really good at it and wanted to cook it. And I remember the thing that like resonated with Chang where he was just always talking about like, you find these restaurants and they don't even have a bathroom yet. And you just want them to get to the point where they get a bathroom, right? And I get it. But I also remember, trips that I've taken, luckily, to Malaysia and Singapore, and just eaten at the best hawker stands. And what I remember is just that, like, there's one communal sink for you to maybe go wash your hands, but there's a bunch of plates stacked next to it. And you really don't want to do that. And you're eating chicken and there's a bunch of feral cats just hanging out nearby because you're just waiting for you to drop the bones. And it just, I don't know where the bathroom here is. I'm not really not planning to wash my hands. I know I can for $12 go next door and get a really nice foot massage and maybe they'll let me use the bathroom there. But it's just this whole thing where, and then you go to Malaysia and Singapore, as you know, and the hawker stands are where like the most well-off locals and also the most well-off tourists actually want to hang out and eat as much as like fancy banquet things because they're like, this is actually the best food. So going to Flushing, going to the Golden Mall, going to other like hidden underground food courts, to me, it just reminded me of like, this is what Asia actually is. This is why it's built like this. This was built by, design. And yes, a lot of it is out of necessity because as a first time tenant, you don't have that much funds in funding and you can just take whatever. But the whole bare bones thing, I mean, it's very Chinese and it's very Asian because remember, a lot of this food really did start where somebody had a cart on the street.
I think one of the most interesting things, I think by now that when this episode is out, our episode with Crystal Koser will also be out. And because I just came from Hong Kong, And I did some traveling around Taiwan with my parents a couple of years ago. Um, and I have two like very short stories that are really distinguish an American immigrant Asian mindset versus somebody who has stayed in Asia. So my mother, when she was growing up in Taipei, she would go to this one dumpling, like steamed bun place every single day after school, or my grandmother would go and pick up like a bag and bring it home, and like they would have it before dinner, or like, you know, for breakfast or something. And we went there because it's still there. My mom was like, oh, that's the same lady who was like making it when she was a kid. This lady was very, very old. And now her children are involved. And I said to her, and when we ate it, I was like, my mind was blown. This was like the most amazing baos I've ever had. And my mom was like, yeah, they've been approached hundreds of times over decades to either move, expand, or franchise, and they refuse. Then there's also that story, I don't know if you saw it on CNN last year, one of the most famous Michelin star Singaporean hawker stands, their children don't want to continue the business, but they wanted to retire, but they refuse to sell the recipe. And so they were like, if our children aren't going to do it, we're just going to close it down. And it was considered such a huge cultural loss to Singapore, but they're not interested in franchising. That is not the mentality. That is a very American mentality. When I was in Asia, everyone would make fun of me because every conversation I'd be like, you should make that a business. That should be a franchise. You'll be a billionaire. And everyone's like, shut up, you stupid American. And at the end of the day, family integrity and culture is a very personal thing, even when it comes to business opportunities. And it takes people, it's a very first generation mindset, like how Crystal is taking your family business and like blowing it up to be like one of the best caterers in Los Angeles. And this like the guy from Xi'an Famous Foods, it's his parents' restaurant, and he made it this mega chain in New York.
Right. They wouldn't have wanted to do it, you know, and there are, and like, look, Resorts World in Las Vegas has opened, you know, their version of a hawker stand, and there are like some actual vendors from Asia, including Singapore. So I'm glad to see that like some of it is you know, heading over and becoming more mainstream. But you're completely right that a lot of these are just like these idiosyncratic family businesses who have done really well, and they're just like, yo, we have enough. We don't need to do this other thing. All of you people, I mean, it's very Asian. All of you people are asking me for something. That means what I have is valuable, and I'm just keeping this shit to myself. That's it, you know? But the thing that you realize, you know, as all of these success stories, like there's so many of these success stories in America and in Asia, whereas, you know, Crystal's moms got into food out of necessity. Crystal got into food as a choice because she could really build this business. This wasn't just about like, oh, I have to feed my family and this is a thing that I can do. And what I've noticed, you know, during my visits to Asia is if you start talking to some of the proprietors of these places, like there's this dumpling place in Taiwan, and you realize it's just little modest dumpling place. And I had the same questions. Why don't you have all these other dumpling places? These dumplings are so good. And it turns out, you know, one of the kids went to school in the UK and then went to school in America and had all these opportunities to do all sorts of things, and talked to his mom and dad about it. They're just like, you go do your other things to make money. This restaurant is fine. And you know why the restaurant is fine? Because this family has worked so hard, and because they were smart about real estate. And I mean, this is a story that is happening all over Taiwan. And I know this for a fact, where the family now owns this building. So they're the tenant for the pachinko lounge that's there. And they're the tenant for the 3 upstairs neighbors. And they still have a whole floor, and they own a dumpling place. And they're just like, we got our whole dream right here, and it's self-contained. And there are multiple generations of our family that like live in this building. We have this successful business. And it's such a mom and dad thing, right? Why would I open another one and have to go somewhere far away from my family? That's stupid. And I'm not going to let anybody else open it. They don't know how to make my food. And, you know, like whenever we, you know, dig a little bit deeper, because hopefully like I'll go back to Taiwan and revisit this place and some other places, I'll give you an update on how a lot of this stuff is going, because I feel like, yeah, there is just this constant push pull. The younger generation is like, we can turn this into a real thing. We can, you know, I'm encouraging people to open up a chain of Chinese restaurants all over campuses. But, you know, very quietly, mom and dad may be millionaires with 3 cars and own an expensive building on this block in Taipei, and are just like, Why would we work so hard just to get a little bit more? We're good, you know? That kind of makes me happy because secretly, you know, a lot of the, you know, not a lot, but some of the hawker stands in Singapore, and I've heard this from people who know, like their families have done really, really well. And, you know, and they have whatever their version of generational wealth is, which is just that, well, our kids are never going to have to pay for real estate because we got it all. What else do we need to worry about? You know, their school's taken care of. And so I kind of like this, right? That there are obviously people like Tony Hsu who can go start, you know, this $1 billion unicorn and grind. But there's this weird thing about how Asians are always striving. But I think a lot of Asians are also just like, you know what? I got enough. It's fine.
That's cultural too. I mean, like I have no work-life balance. I think as
No.
Americans, we grew up in the States. We've been trained to look at everything as an opportunity for expansion and scale. And that is just not the cultural mindset in certain parts of Asia. However, I don't know if you saw that episode of that show, like Street Food on Netflix, where they profiled this woman's this family streets food stall, and I can't remember what they sold, but they profiled the street stall. Maybe it was like a fish head soup. They profiled the street stall in,
I'm pretty sure I watched this with my mom and dad when they were in LA.
yeah,
Yeah, they watched the whole series.
that there was an episode about this girl who came back from university to help her parents run their fish head soup stall, and her parents refused to take credit cards, refused to get on Deliveroo, refused to do all
Oh, I
these like
remember this.
modern
Yeah.
things because they're like, we're fine. And so what the girl did was she was like, okay. And her parents would work during the day and she would work the night shift. And where her parents went home, she would like put everything on Deliveroo. She would start doing all these internet things secretly. And her parents were like, why are we selling so much soup? And she was like, no, I don't know. I don't know. And I love that. I love how there are people in the next generation trying to build the business and preserve something for the next generation. I don't know if you have this too, but when I went back to Taiwan, one of the things that was most surprising to me was how my parents didn't think it was important to show me and my sister, my brother didn't come, but like me and my sister, like where they used to hang out. They're like, why would you want to see that? And I'm like, please just take us to where you used to hang out. But they didn't understand why we wanted to hold on or to see or to experience that part of history, because when they immigrated and our entire family moved to New York, all of our extended family, there was no reason for them to remain. And also Taipei has changed so drastically since the 1970s. And I don't know if it's just generational. I don't know if you had the same experience with your parents. My dad, like, he was like, oh, let's go to this place that I used to get tempura all the time after school. But besides
Right.
that, they were like uninterested in showing us anything they used to do. I don't know if you had the same experience.
No, I mean, it was similar with my parents. Like, obviously, like they took me to the night market and a couple things that were like special to them. But I think that the reason that they took me, though, wasn't so much that it was special to them, but just because it's like, well, this is the big deal night market that you should just see. So let's just go, you know? And so it's not easy to get stories out of about their relationships to these things when you go there. Right. And a lot of times they just want to take you to whatever they think the new thing is because they think that, like, okay, this is what you care about. Right. So,
Yeah.
yeah, I mean, but yeah, it would be amazing if, you know, just the Asian American chefs, you know, that we know were able to get their parents' lists of like what the best restaurants are in certain cities. But I don't think that would be an easy thing to get because it's Asian parents. Every list would be qualified. Like, well, what do you want this for? You know, who are you sharing it with? And it's just all of that, you know?
I also found that list making is also extremely different from region to region, specifically in mainland China. So I've been lucky to go to I spent a lot of time traveling back and forth from New York to mainland when I had the chance to a few years ago. And what I found that in certain provinces, no one knew the name of any restaurant. So for example, I feel like this must have happened. Maybe this happened in both Chengdu and in Xi'an. So I would even talk to the hotel concierge and I would be like, what is your list of restaurants that you recommend for people coming to this wonderful luxury hotel? They're new in town. They would literally say things to me like, okay, you have to walk 3 blocks that way, then make a left, and there'll be a man. And I'm like, what? I'm like, what is the name of the restaurant? And the answer would always be, I don't know, but look for this man and this kind of awning. So unless the restaurant is a landmark, and most of these restaurants have been around for a long time, they're not new. But I think that this is also probably cultural, but me going there as a food editor, an editor at like a major American publication, I was like, just give me the name.
Yeah,
But it
right.
doesn't exist like that because
I
it's
know. And some
so
of these things
community
you
driven.
actually can't Google.
Yeah,
I
ungoogleable.
mean, I've had these trips to Asia, where I've been with people who are the quote unquote food experts of whatever city we're in. I mean, not just like Taiwan, but also Japan. And a lot of these restaurants really, it is this thing where you have to know the guy who knows the guy. And, like there's this one restaurant that we went to in Tokyo, and we figured out now, like, we found the chef on Instagram. But even looking at that chef on Instagram, you can't really figure out where his restaurant is. It's like they're purposely trying to hide this from you.
I think it's because there's so much, and this is, and I mean, culturally, I am American, I'm a Westerner, and I totally understand I'm Asian on my face, but I'm not really Asian. My heritage is Asian, but I'm American. Because when I go there, I understand why people would feel that it's really hard to figure things out, and even in big cities, right? So I think the idea of Asia being impenetrable, and that this idea that like it's closed off to Westerners, that is by design, because everything is very community driven, everything is very family orientated, like very private. And if you know good stuff, you keep it to yourself. No one's out there
Yeah.
evangelizing like you and me talking about legend all the time. So I think
Yeah, no, it's
yeah.
intimidating for outsiders. But, and one thing, and we'll talk about this in another episode because I'm sure a lot of guests want to talk about this. It's also intimidating to be in Asia and to be somebody who, like you're saying, looks Chinese, but isn't well versed enough to get into a conversation at a restaurant about what you actually want. Because that, in some ways, is actually much worse than being a white person. Because it's like everybody's embarrassed, and then the logical thing is you just kind of leave the restaurant, or
I
you
don't know.
glom onto somebody who takes pity on you and just they order food for you.
Usually I've been pretty lucky where people have been pretty nice to me, even though my like Chinese is at like, I speak Chinese at like an 8-year-old level. But I do think that my probably the experience at a Chinese restaurant that I've been most offended by was actually in San Francisco. So I growing up in New York, I've always heard about those experiences where if you go to a Chinese restaurant in America, sometimes they give you a menu that is just for people who don't speak or
Right.
read Chinese. That has never happened to me because I grew up in New York City. I would eat out a lot with my parents. I speak enough Chinese to get by. I don't know. I look Chinese. I went to San Francisco the first time I ever went there, maybe like 10 years ago, maybe longer. I went to a restaurant in San Francisco, Chinatown, and I sat down and they gave me a menu that was an English menu and only had 15 things on it. And I was looking around, everyone else in the restaurant was Chinese, and they were all eating things that were not on the menu that I was given. And I was so offended. And I think I left because I was so offended, because I think I asked them for another menu. They're like, no, that's the menu. I'm like, this is not the menu. And that was a very weird experience to have in America. And I think this is neither here nor there, but I feel like this is all part of the belonging and not belonging, and even feeling excluded from, your own community of people wherever you go. I don't know. It's
Yeah.
an interesting place to be as a third culture kid.
There's definitely like restaurants, that probably have 4 sets of menus. And it's basically just like beginner American to advanced American to actual Chinese person. And I get it. Like it makes business sense. But the other interesting dynamic in my life with things like this is that my wife is not Asian. My wife is white. There's been all sorts of weird things that have happened to us restaurants over the years, not even really like overtly racist from Chinese people, but just things that were funny, right? Like there's this restaurant that we really liked in New York Chinatown called Moon House, and my wife will never forget that we were eating soup dumplings, fried soup dumplings, so the shencheng bao, and she had the dumpling in the chopstick about to go to her mouth, and as she had her mouth open, was about to put it on, somebody just handed her a spoon just in case she needed to catch it while she's in the middle of fucking eating it. It's like almost in her mouth. But because of that, in a strange way, my wife is just super fortified when she goes to these restaurants, and she has no shame, and she's not embarrassed the way that I get. So, one thing that, and this is yet another topic we can talk about another time, but one thing that we like to do when we're in Paris is go at least eat one meal at the corner Chinese place, because it really just shows you, how migration patterns and where people end up like change things, right? So the corner Chinese places in Paris are more refined than the corner Chinese places in New York, because it turns out in New York, people want Chinese American thing. They want egg rolls, they want fried chicken wings and all that. And in Paris, they just want, a more accessible version of fancy dim sum and nice, like, fluffy egg fried rice and all that. So we go get the food. It's really good. But whenever I go to these things, I'm just, I am slightly embarrassed, ashamed, because I don't speak great Chinese. I don't speak great French. I'm just basically like the dumb American pointing at things, right? So my wife, who actually does speak French and doesn't let on that much, decided that the one time that we went, order our food, and then she just said "sheshe" to them on the way out, because she just wanted to be like, yeah, I actually know how to speak a little bit Chinese. And the women in this restaurant were so happy that she did. They smiled at her, they waved at her, they like knew us when we walked back, because it's like it doesn't really take that much, because it's just like you're making the effort, right? And that was one smart thing that my wife always said, like, when you walk into a bakery in Paris, if you speak a little French and you make an effort, like usually it's the opposite of what you've heard. They're pretty nice to you if you've just tried and you just want to give them whatever, $8 for a loaf of bread,
I think that's true
and you've tried.
anywhere. That's true
Yeah.
anywhere. Yeah, especially it. I joke around a lot with my English friends that they're like, "Oh, Americans are so positive and friendly." I'm like, it's because we all secretly know that Americans abroad are like the most annoying people. So if I can just like
Yeah.
lower the bar and just try to not be annoying, and even friendliness can be annoying. For example, in Paris, if you're friendly, you have to be like polite. You say bonjour, au revoir, you say all the nice things. But if you try to be too friendly, then they're like, oh, you're so annoying. So there's a very fine line, but I agree. And also Erin is like super blonde and like super American looking, because she's like blonde hair and like light eyes,
Mhm.
right? So I think that it really surprises people when she like, pulls out the big gun, speaks French and speaks Chinese.
Yeah. Or just like goes to the Szechuan restaurant and orders the most aggressive things because she likes it now. All right. So there is a Chinese company that has now made a rideable robot for children. I mean, it was on seekingalpha.com. You can go look at it. I don't know how many of you, like the people who know me well, know that I think about dystopia and that show Black Mirror, and just the idea, what if phones, but too much, right? Which is basically what some smart person said Black Mirror is about, and about how screens and technology are going to change everything in these drastic ways. Me seeing this writable robot for children just reminds me of like that Boston Dynamics robot, which can do parkour, that I worry at some point it's going to accidentally like kill somebody, like when it ends up being security at an Amazon warehouse in 10 years or something.
What is the
Because there
difference
was,
between, sorry, what is the difference between like a rideable robot? I haven't seen this. So if you could tell us a little bit about what it looks like, but what is the difference between a rideable robot versus like, those kiddie cars that people drive around in, or I don't know anything about kids stuff, but what is
so,
like the
so,
fundamental difference?
so that's a great question, right? Because there are definitely like all these little rideable cars that kids can drive, right? But the thing about this robot is the robot basically, like, it looks to me like it's a hound dog, right? Or just some sort of four-legged animal. And you sit on it and it moves. And so the scary part for me about it is like, I think the point is that this robot eventually can be autonomous, or it can just, or at the very least, it can be controlled via remote control or something, meaning that the person riding this doesn't really have control. It's not like you're a kid on a big wheel or a bike. You can just stop, right? Even if you have one of those motorized cars, you can just stop, right? Technically, there's going to be some grown-up or some other force that makes it stop. But as somebody who watched that Metalhead episode of Black Mirror, where essentially like whatever the robot security for, I think, the UPS or the shipping plant, like ended up getting deadly and really, really hurting people, and became this man and machine thing. I just like foresee some future. It's like where you're trying to get it to stop, but it malfunctions, or it just decides that running really fast is fun, or it just decides that like it should really test its AI and just start crashing into shit. Now, look, this may just end up being a really cool Christmas toy that I just buy for my children, but I think about these dystopias a lot, but then I also think about the fact like, well, You can have a rideable robot and you can have all these other things. How soon before Tony Shu at DoorDash just figures out how to get a robot to come to my house and just bring me food, right?
I'm okay with
You know,
that.
Malcolm, yeah, I mean, Malcolm Gladwell, he had a really funny episode about Waymo, which is the self-driving Google car, where what he decided to do was he decided to fuck with the car, where he would just run in front of it, run next to it, and just to see if it would like slow down and malfunction and all that, because he just wanted to see what happens if you try to disrupt something like this, right? And the conclusion was really interesting, right? Because something like Waymo or something like, like any robotic cars or any robotic delivery system, it is dependent on the fact that everybody decides that they're going to play along and this is the system, right? Because if one person defies it, right, and disrupts the whole robot car traffic pattern, then all the other robots aren't going to know how to react, right? All
It's the
the other
same as
robots are,
yeah. It's the same as
yeah,
self-driving cars. Like whoever goes to market first with the technology gets to decide the framework.
right. But then if the other things that are built then just decide, well, this framework is bullshit and we're not going to stop when this other car says we should stop, what the fuck happens? I mean, this is the type of thing that I sort of think about all the time. But I do believe, as we all believe, that Uber and DoorDash and all these companies, because they're basically like, we don't have drivers, we have technology. They're looking forward to some world where they eliminate human beings as much as possible. So we'll see.
I mean, I have a couple of thoughts on this riding robot thing. One is I don't think that we should give kids something unless it's been tested on grown-ups first. So get some grown-up riding like robots, like wheelies,
Yeah.
like those shoes with the wheels on them. They should have tested them on adults first before giving them to children because they're dangerous. But these riding robots, they should make adult-sized ones just to see. And two, the other strategy that I've witnessed that my brother and my sister-in-law do all the time is that if they are gifted really noisy or large or mechanical or annoying toys for their kids for the holidays or for birthdays, they let the kids play with it for a few days and then they'll just like take the batteries out. And then everyone is like, okay, well, it's ran out of batteries. Then it's over. So just, maybe you buy it and if you don't like it, don't charge it again.
Yeah. So, I mean, I totally do understand why now, as a parent and just as somebody who like sort of sees the future, I'm kind of okay with spending my own time like looking at NFTs in the metaverse, just like I'm okay with my children mainly playing online games. Because a lot of these things that are going to occur in the, quote unquote real world with technology, I don't want to be the super early adopter of that, right? It's sort of like I'm kind of happy. I was an early adopter of Google Glass. I was one of the people who got to test it, and it was great in a lot of ways. But I'm actually not so secretly happy that that thing did not succeed, and we're not all walking around with these fucking glasses that are maps or translators or communication devices, and also filming every single thing that's happening, right?
I'm
So we
pretty
can just
surprised
go
that like
back and
never
look at our
went
whole
anywhere.
life.
I'm pretty surprised that the glasses have not, that whole technology has not evolved further. You've seen the new Ray-Ban Facebook glasses? And they're like, you can record using the glasses. And I'm like, this is what the very first Snapchat glasses were, because I had those. I like
Right.
queued up and I bought, they were so expensive, but they just record like 30 seconds of video. But I can't believe that glasses technology has not actually improved in all those years since I remember seeing a woman sitting front row at a fashion show in New York the week that Google Glasses went into like beta or whatever. She worked at Google. She was like filming it for something. I was like, oh, that's not that good looking, but I can see this having use cases. And now what we have is, I guess, the one thing that's like an eyeball wearable that has really gotten popular is that Oculus, VR thing that has gotten really big, but that's also taken a long time, right? I think technology is just sort of, it seems to, these wearables seem to like surge and then stall. There doesn't seem to be a
Yeah.
tremendous amount
No,
of
and
innovation.
then I think about it, like I think about Google Glass, and then I also think about how, not just Asian parents, but parents just are. And this isn't something that happened to me, but this happened to somebody else who also got Google Glass early. And they were telling me this great story where typical parental response. What did you get? Google Glass. What does it do? Friend explains. What does this cost? $1,500. What the hell are you going to use it for? And they're just like, all right, mom and dad, we're not going to get into this right now, right? Because they're now just like upset, right? That like the idea of this would happen. And then my friend's dad gets the Google Glass, starts looking around, filming things, and doesn't understand what work. And my friend is just basically like, um, you're recording stuff. You don't understand that you could easily publish it. Just don't say Facebook because it'll just like auto publish. And his dad doesn't hear what he's saying. So he just like looks at the thing he's filming and goes, wait, what? Facebook? And then it like publishes like this thing. He's like, no, 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 no. And then, but that, I'm sure my friend's dad like thinks of that story and was just like, yeah, I told you that thing was stupid. Who cares?
But I mean, I think I'm always worried, especially now that I'm in my 40s. And I started being worried about this even in my 30s. I was worried that I was going to fall behind on technology. And I think it's so like our parents' generation, it was kind of not a big deal for them to fall behind on technology because their jobs and us working in media, our parents' jobs were not reliant on having the latest iPhone or knowing how to use Instagram or understanding how YouTube works, right? Or algorithms. I don't think my parents know what an algorithm is. But I think for our generation, we're just at the cusp because we're like late Gen X. If we don't keep up in 5 years, it'll be too late.
Yeah. Andrew Steinthal, who just sold Infatuation to JP Morgan Chase, like he tweeted or he amplified something that was making the point that like people are only starting to catch up to understand that media companies, whatever they are going to be able to use NFTs for audience engagement and retention in ways that like other things can't accomplish, right? And that guy has already had like whatever his unicorn exit, and I mean he's gonna do all these other things. So yeah, you're right. We sort of have to know. We sort of have to know about these things, right? And the story that I've been telling recently, I just bought a bunch of these silly NFTs called Currency Punks, which is a mashup of the really valuable crypto punks and this project that Damien Hirst is doing. And the reason that I bring this up is it's one of those things where you could say that it's a double homage. You could say it's a double meme. You could say it's a double parody. You could say that you're just wasting money buying JPEGs. I fucking agree with all of this. These were super cheap. I bought one that looked like me. I bought one that looked like my wife. I minted a couple other ones. No big deal. It didn't really cost me that much money. But I wanted to be part of this cultural moment because I missed the first two. And the Damien Hirst thing is the thing that really sort of explains what's going on. That I think like if you explain this to anybody who's like an Asian parent, they'll be like, oh yeah, this is what I've been talking to you about all the time, about like what actually is value, who gets to decide value, right? And there's this really prominent investor, Suzu of Three Arrows Capital in Singapore, one of the biggest crypto investors. And he pointed something out on Twitter that basically said, if you don't know about the Damien Hirst thing, read this. And this is the thing that's going to red pill you. So Damien Hirst has a set of 10,000 colorful dot artworks that are on the Ethereum blockchain that you can just buy. They all correspond to an actual piece of art, like a physical piece of art that's like locked up somewhere in the UK. At a certain point in time, as an owner of one of the NFTs of the digital art, you get to make a choice. Do you keep the digital one or do we send you the print? But whichever one you don't keep gets destroyed. So we either burn the NFT or we burn the actual painting. And you know that a Damien Hirst painting has tangible value. So I think about something, like my Asian parents, right? And about how they've always were like, you should buy real estate because real estate is the thing that it, like will always be there and exist. And you should invest in tangible things and not things that are virtual. But then at the same time, they see the face of one of the biggest crypto investors in the world, and they see that, oh, he's in Singapore and he's tweeting about NFT art galleries in Hong Kong, and he's a Chinese person, and DoorDash is started by a Chinese person, and Yahoo was co-started by a Chinese person, and they're just like, okay, maybe this other thing is legitimate too. But like, I haven't even had this conversation with my mom and dad, but I want to like ask them, like, what do you think? Is the thing on my phone more valuable because of what it represents, or is the thing you can hang up more valuable? Because I know 30 years ago you told me one thing, but what do you believe now?
I think this is just a very latent adoption. I think that our parents' generation is only just now starting to come around to the concept of information as currency. So they're just at that step. I mean, our parents' generation was definitely the land generation because it was you own a piece of earth And it was a generation that got into even stocks extremely late. Like this is
Yeah.
not a generation that put their money in the stock market because they had seen bad shit happen. And so it just didn't feel like a real thing. It feels like gambling to that generation.
Right.
So the fact that they can even wrap their minds around the idea of information as currency, as somebody like, like the Yahoo founder and these big empires like Alibaba, and understanding e-commerce. They didn't understand e-commerce even until they engaged in it. Like literally Amazon changed the game for our parents' generation. So
Yeah.
that they're just adopting it now, and they're still not super comfortable with the stock market, but they get it now. And I think that the idea of collecting art for a lot of first generation immigrant parents is just not on the radar, right? It's not like a thing. They understand music and art as culture, but they're not collectors in general. And
Right. Well, they're not collectors of art, but they're collectibles of things that they think are tangible, right? Because think about all
buildings.
the Chinese American families,
Yeah.
buildings, but also jade, and before, it had all these negative connotations, ivory or grand pianos, but like things that like you could touch, right?
Wait, grand pianos. So we need to do a podcast episode about pianos because my parents are obsessed with the value of pianos. That's all they talk about.
Right. And so there's like all these physical assets, but if you really think about what they were buying stores of value, right? Stores of value. People have been buying gold as a store of value for years. Now they're buying crypto as a store of value and it all ties back to everything that's going on because, like Evergrande, that company in that big real estate and company in China that might collapse and really threw the whole world financial markets in turmoil this week. It might end up getting bailed out. You know what happens when a country bails out a company? They just print more money. Do you know what happened? Like for all this COVID relief, the United States just printed more money. Now, if you're a reasonable person, and if you're a reasonable Chinese person who's always thought about the value of money, that on some level, like the idea of inflation, has got to be horribly offensive to you because you're just like, I worked so hard for this, and now somebody's just going to go make more of it, right? And what I have isn't worth as much, right? And it's like, all right, guess what, Chinese people? You're not alone in feeling this, right? There's people in all these countries all over the world who feel this, which is why different stores of value like crypto and arguably NFTs are becoming this whole thing because people are just like, I don't like this other system. I mean, like, think about it, Danica, right? The dream and I'm sure you heard this because this was also a very Chinese thing. And I've heard this from other people who've had, Chinese parents. The dream back in the day when we were their kids was just like, our family of immigrants is just going to make a couple $1 million because of the way that it works right now. We can just live off the interest because you could just put $1 million in the bank and get like whatever 5-7%. And now when you can't even get like 0.05%, people are starting to think about lots of other things to do with their money. So, and once you start doing that, then I think the allure of physical things becomes a little bit less because it's like, wow, it's really unwieldy to have a grand piano. Like if I sell a grand piano, this grand piano needs to be transported and disassembled and reassembled. But I have this thing on my phone that I can just send you and it's worth money. Maybe I should try that thing too.
Listen, I totally agree that like in this age where government's just printing money, decentralized finance makes a lot of sense. And if you think about our parents' generation, because they were immigrants, it makes sense that they want to hold on to something physical because they left their home. But their parents, because our parents, both of our sets of parents are from Taiwan. And in Taiwan, in our grandparents' generation, was occupied by the Japanese when they were growing up. And for that generation, they hoarded gold. And so they would have gold bars, right? And like a lot of that turned into real estate for our parents' generation. And then in our generation, we're like, well, what's our gold bars? What's our real estate? A lot of us cannot get on the property ladder like in a proper way. So we're going to invest in crypto. We're going to invest in these assets that become the benchmark for the future.
Right. Or I'm going to buy tech stocks because it's like, in a way, that's sort of like more democratic and populist in a way, because the thing that like has happened a lot in Taiwan and actually happened with my family, and I've heard the story and I probably need to get more into specifics about it. Like my grandparents had some land taken away because of eminent domain, because the government wanted to like build something, a museum or something. I've never really like dug into it. Apparently, like they got a good amount of money for it or what they thought was fair. But I think that a lot of the things now, like that are happening now, are also just a reaction to wait. I did everything I was supposed to, but it still got taken away from me, and it was completely out of my control. Which is why, like a lot of people, like in this new world, are always just talking about I want custody of my assets and why that word is so important. So no, and it's
Yeah.
just super interesting because it ties into IP for chefs and all these other things. Like as a chef, what can you really monetize? Can you monetize your recipes? Well, yes, if you do a cookbook, but people just steal those things, so they don't end up being worth that much. Can you monetize your logo? Oh, I never thought about it. Maybe I can. Can I monetize the fact that I can get on the phone and teach people how to cook? Maybe I can. So all of a sudden, there's these people who used to do one thing, which is just like, I'm on the walk making noodles all the time. But now they're suddenly realizing that I have created all this intellectual property surrounding it. So what do I do with it? Do I want the sauce line in Whole Foods, or am I good? And I think what's going to be fun about this podcast is we're going to talk to a lot of people who've been through these experiences, and they can tell us what they decided.
This is all also so American, because if you think about the chef owner, and I did not really realize this until I spent a lot more time in Asia, the concept of a chef owner is actually so American. In the rest of the world, so many of the top chefs in the world work in hotel restaurants, because
Yeah.
those are the only restaurants that can afford the ingredients, that can afford the salaries that they need to have the best staffs in the world to keep the chef in the kitchen working. Chef owners, it's just not a possibility, especially in Asia, where real estate in big cities is so much more expensive than we can even imagine. So in Hong Kong, everything's a restaurant group. Most restaurant groups are owned by extremely wealthy generational wealth people. So it's not like someone made $1 billion and decided to start a restaurant group. It's usually generational wealth, or it's owned by
Yeah.
huge hotels, which in turn are owned by billionaires. So it's what is so distinctive about American food culture is partially attributed to this chef owner idea, and the idea of creating a brand, and the idea
Right.
of potentially scaling it and understanding the masses, but also retaining that sort of like what Shirley talked about was her identity, her culinary identity. And that is such like that's so American. And this is why this is going to be so interesting during this podcast.
Yeah, I think that like chefs in America, like, yeah, they want to assert their ownership, right? Chinese American chefs in America want to do that. And I get it. And there are, like in Taipei, for example, there are a handful of places, right, where the restaurants are owned by the family, but there's no such thing as a chef owner because nobody thinks of them as the chef of the restaurant. Do you know why they own the restaurant? They own the restaurant because years ago, a grandparent or a great grandparent just was smart about buying real estate. So the thing that they actually own that they think is valuable is the real estate, right? And they had the real estate, they had the ground floor, so they just decided to open a noodle place. But like, who's the chef? Well, mom and dad were, but mom and dad are retired now, so I guess I am. And I hired all these people and they can cook better than I. But like, it would be a really funny thing just going around Taipei, like, and asking, like, who's the executive chef of this restaurant? Because they don't look at you like, the fuck are you talking about?
No one will tell you. Also, it's a
Yeah.
secret, by the way. It's a secret.
Yeah.
They're not going to tell you. They're going to kick you out of the restaurant. You're not going to get your food. You won't be allowed to eat there. You'll never be able to grace that door again. And this is the difference between like, I was always so surprised that there were no really amazing food publications in all the different cities I went to in Asia. Sure, there are some, but they mostly cover like hotels because they have PR. But otherwise, no one is interested in being featured. Nobody wants to talk to you. Everything's a secret. And the restaurant has no name. So I have to go around the corner and find the guy. That's it.
Yeah. I mean, so yeah. I mean, I don't think we're going to be able to name a lot of these restaurants, but we're going to have some fun doing some other things. So, I mean, I think this is a good place to sort of wrap up because I think what you're going to understand after listening to these is we're going to do some podcasts with us and lots of different friends where we just talk about the things that interest us. Obviously, it all ties back to being Chinese American and to the food that we love. But, as we've sort of pointed out, it's like real estate, tech, family, all of these things. I mean, it all ties in. It all ties into this one thing. And a lot of the people that we all know who are, very much working in worlds of real estate, tech, crypto, entertainment. One big reason that I'm friends with them is because they always just call me and like, yo, where should we go eat this weekend? Because it's just this thing, right? Or they're Instagramming photos of their cookbooks or the chicken that they made at home. So yeah.
Great. I love this episode. If you want to find us, you can find us on Instagram at Chinese Food Fight Club. If you have suggestions for guests, you can actually email us at ChineseFoodFightClub@gmail.com. Andy, where can people find you on social media?
On all social platforms, you can find me at Andy Wang, NYLA.
And I'm at Danica Lowe. Thank you so much for listening, and we will see you guys next time.